The first time I noticed her avoiding dinner, I thought it was simple shyness, after all. Meeting your boyfriend's family can feel like walking into a room full of expectations. Smiles that don't quite reach the eyes, questions that linger too long, and that unspoken need to impress. Her name was Emily. My son, Matthew, brought her home one Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the scent of roasted garlic and rosemary filled the house, and the light streaming through the curtains painted everything in gold. She was polite, soft-spoken and beautiful in a quiet way, not the kind of beauty that shouts for attention, but one that hums gently in the background, warm, honest, and unsure of itself. But from the very beginning, something about her felt tense. When I offered her a plate at the dinner table, she smiled nervously and said, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you." I already ate. The lie was easy to spot. The way her stomach growled softly as she said it, the way her eyes darted toward the food and back down to her hands, it was almost painful to watch. Matthew didn't notice. He was too busy telling her stories, laughing in that careless way he used to when he was a little boy. But I did notice, and I remember thinking, why won't she eat with us? Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Whenever I invited them over for Sunday dinner, she would find an excuse. "I've got an early morning tomorrow. I promised my friend I'd help her move. I'm not feeling too great today." Always polite, always distant. At first, I told myself not to take it personally. Maybe she had social anxiety. Maybe she just wasn't used to family settings. But mothers have instincts, and mine was whispering that something wasn't right. Because the few times she did come over, she was careful, too careful, especially around my husband, David. She'd smile at him the way people smile at fire, with warmth, but from a safe distance. If he spoke to her, she'd tense up, fidgeting with her sleeve or adjusting her necklace as if trying to keep her hands busy. And sometimes, when his voice grew louder from across the room, I'd see her flinch ever so slightly. It was subtle but not invisible, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That night after they left, I asked David what he thought of her. "She's fine," he said, shrugging. "A bit quiet, maybe." He didn't even look up from his newspaper, but something in his tone, flat, detached, made me pause. David wasn't usually indifferent about people. He was the kind of man who formed opinions fast and shared them faster. Yet with Emily, he seemed uncomfortable. Over time, curiosity turned to worry. Then worry turned to suspicion. One Sunday, I called Matthew and asked if they'd come by for dinner again. He hesitated. "Mom, I don't think Emily's up for it." "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He sighed. "She's just been off lately. It's complicated." Complicated, that word sat in my chest like a stone, so I decided to do something I'd never done before. I invited Emily alone. I told her I wanted to get to know her better, woman to woman. She sounded hesitant but agreed. When she arrived, she looked pale, like someone carrying a secret too heavy for her small frame. I made tea. Chamomile with honey. The kind you offer when you're not just being polite but trying to say you're safe here. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and for the first few minutes, silence filled the air like thick fog. "Finally," I said softly, "Emily, I hope you know you can talk to me. Whatever it is that's been bothering you, I won't judge." Her eyes welled up instantly. She looked down, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand, as if embarrassed to let them fall. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to be rude before. It's hard for me to be here sometimes." "Why?" I asked. My voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, biting her lip, her hands trembling around the teacup. And then she said something I will never forget. "Because I know your husband." The world seemed to still in that moment. I tried to speak, but no words came. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. Emily looked terrified, like she'd just said something she couldn't take back. "What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask. She looked at me, her eyes full of something that wasn't anger or guilt. It was sorrow. "I don't mean from now. I mean from before, years ago." She took a deep breath and told me something that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and the man I'd shared a life with for 25 years. But before she spoke again, she whispered, "Please don't hate me for this. And in that moment, I knew whatever truth was about to come out. It would change everything. Emily's hands trembled as she set her teacup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the table. I could see the conflict in her eyes, a war between fear and the desperate need to unburden herself. "I met David years ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before I met Matthew, I didn't even know he had a family." My breath caught in my throat. Every word felt like a thread being pulled from the fabric of my life, slow. "Quiet, inevitable," she went on, staring at the steam curling above her tea. "I was 19, working at a coffee shop downtown. He used to come in every morning, black coffee, 2 sugars. He was kind at first, charming, the kind of man who looked at you like he really saw you." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she looked too young to carry the weight she was holding. "One day, he offered me a ride home after my shift. I said yes. I shouldn't have. The room seemed to shrink around us. Every sound, the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator grew louder, like the world itself was leaning in to listen. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. She swallowed hard. "He told me he was divorced. Said he was lonely. We went out a few times. I thought it was something real." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "But then one night he just stopped coming. No call, no message. I found out later he wasn't divorced. He had a wife. And a son." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with guilt. "That son was Matthew." It was as if all the air had been sucked from the room. My hands were shaking now too. David, my husband, the man who'd promised me forever, who'd kissed my forehead every morning before work, who'd told me I was the love of his life, and now, sitting in front of me, was the living reminder of a betrayal I never saw coming. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only thing between us was the truth, raw, uninvited, and shattering. Finally, Emily whispered, "I didn't know Matthew was your son until after we started dating. When he introduced me to you both, I thought I was going to faint. I recognized your husband the moment I saw him." Her voice trembled as she continued. "That's why I couldn't stay for dinner. Why I made excuses. I didn't want to lie to you, but I didn't want to ruin everything either. I love Matthew, Mrs. Green, I really do. But I couldn't sit across the table from that man and pretend like nothing ever happened." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I forced myself to breathe. To think. It was too much to process at once: the betrayal, the years of silence, the realization that the person my son loved was connected to the darkest corner of my marriage. Emily looked at me, her expression pleading. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt anyone." I nodded slowly, though my mind was miles away. "You didn't," I said softly. "At least not intentionally. But the truth was someone had." That night, after Emily left, I sat alone in the living room. The shadows stretched long across the walls, and every sound of the house felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to a stranger. David was working late, or so he'd said, for the first time in years. I wondered if that was still true. I found myself thinking back the business trips, the sudden meetings, the unexplained absences that I'd once written off as part of his job. Maybe I'd chosen not to see what was there all along. When I finally heard the front door open, my heart clenched. He walked in, tired as always, loosening his tie. "Hey," he said with a smile that now felt rehearsed. "Everything okay?" I looked at him, studying his face, the lines around his eyes, the silver in his hair. How many lies could fit behind one man's familiar smile? "David," I said quietly, "do you remember a girl named Emily? From a coffee shop about 6 years ago?" He froze. Just for a second, but that second told me everything. The shift in his expression was small but undeniable. His eyes darted away, his mouth tightening. Then, just as quickly, he forced a laugh. "No, can't say I do." "Why?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, really looked. And in that moment, I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. He was a man wearing the face of someone I used to love. I wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but I didn't. Instead, I said quietly, "She's Matthew's girlfriend." That made him go pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like a man struggling to catch words that refused to come. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. That can't be." "It is," I said. "And she remembers you." The silence that followed was heavy. David sank into the chair across from me, his face buried in his hands. I waited. When he finally looked up, there was no denial left. Just exhaustion. "I made a mistake," he said softly. "A long time ago." I closed my eyes. Because mistake felt too small for what he'd done. Too neat, too simple. He didn't just cheat. He built a life out of half-truths and silences, and I'd been living in the space between them, but still he was my husband. And our son loved that girl. Somewhere between heartbreak and disbelief, I whispered, "What are we supposed to do now?" David didn't answer. He just sat there, staring into nothing, the weight of what he'd done pressing down on both of us. And in that stillness, I realized that secrets don't destroy people all at once. They eat away at them, slowly, quietly, until one day there's nothing left but the echo of what once was. That night stretched on endlessly. David and I sat in silence long after the clock struck midnight. The air between us felt thick, heavy with years of unspoken truths and the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. He didn't try to touch me. Didn't even reach for my hand? Perhaps he knew any touch from him would have felt like salt against an open wound. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. "I didn't know she was that young. I swear, I thought she was in her 20s. It was only for a few weeks, and then I stopped. I regretted it for years. Regret." The word felt hollow in his mouth. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But belief requires trust, and trust is a fragile thing. Once cracked, it doesn't shatter loudly. It just slowly crumbles in silence. "Do you realize what you've done?" I asked, my voice shaking. "That girl is in love with your son. You've entangled all of us in something none of us can escape from." He lowered his gaze, guilt painted across his features. "I never wanted this to happen. If I'd known, but you did know," I cut in. "You knew what you were risking when you lied to me, when you betrayed this family." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't stop. My heart had been split open, and every syllable was a piece of it spilling out. David didn't argue. Maybe he couldn't. He simply whispered, "I'm sorry, Ellen. I really am." I turned away because I couldn't bear to see his face anymore. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat on the edge of the bed while David lay beside me, pretending to rest. The sound of his breathing, once comforting, now felt unbearable. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to protect Matthew from the truth. At least until I knew what the right thing to do was. But the universe has a cruel way of taking the timing out of our hands. 2 days later, Matthew showed up at the house, angry, anxious, confused. Emily had told him everything. He didn't knock. He just walked in, slamming the door behind him. "Mom, is it true?" he demanded. His voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. Did he really have something with Emily before she met me? I froze. The way he said it, something as if he couldn't bear to name it for what it was. David appeared from the hallway, face pale. "Matthew, don't!" my son snapped, his voice trembling. "Don't say my name like that." For a moment, I saw my little boy in him again, the one who used to run to me after school with scraped knees and wild stories. But that little boy was gone. The man standing before me was staring at a father he no longer recognized. "Why?" Matthew asked, tears burning in his eyes. "You always told me about integrity, about honesty. You said a man's worth is in how he treats the people he loves. Was that all a lie, too?" David looked crushed. His mouth opened, then closed again. The silence between father and son was unbearable, a chasm too wide to bridge with apologies. "I didn't know," David finally said. "When I met her, she was just a stranger. I didn't know she'd end up in your life." That's not the point," Matthew shouted. "You lied to Mom, you cheated, and now I can't even look at the woman I love without seeing you." He turned to me, his expression breaking. "How long have you known?" My lips parted, but no sound came. "Just recently," I whispered. "Emily told me herself." Matthew's eyes softened for a second, but only briefly. "And you didn't tell me?" "I wanted to protect you," I said quietly. He shook his head. "Protect me from what?" "The truth." "Mom, you can't protect people from the truth. It finds its way out no matter how much you try to bury it. The truth. The one thing that can both set you free and destroy you completely." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "I don't even know what to do anymore. I love her, Mom, I really do. But how can I stay with someone who was once with my father?" There was no right answer. only pain layered and unrelenting. Emily wasn't at fault for what happened years ago. Neither was Matthew. But somehow they were both standing in the wreckage of something they didn't create. When Matthew left that night, he didn't look back. After he was gone, I found David sitting at the dining table, staring blankly at the wall. "I've lost him," he whispered. "He'll never forgive me." I wanted to say something comforting, but I couldn't, because in that moment, I wasn't sure I could forgive him either. Days passed, but the house never felt the same again. Matthew stopped answering our calls. Emily moved out of her apartment. Her mother told me she went to stay with an aunt in another city. The silence that followed was deafening. Every corner of our home echoed with what used to be laughter, warmth, togetherness. Now there was only distance, and every night, when I passed by the dining table, I couldn't help but notice the empty chair where Emily should have sat, the same chair she'd always avoided. Maybe she knew from the start that secrets have a way of poisoning even the safest places. Maybe that's why she stayed away. But the part that broke me most wasn't David's betrayal or Emily's pain. It was watching my son lose both the love of his life and the trust he'd always had in his family all in one breath. The days that followed felt hollow, like the world had lost its sound. Even the clock on the wall seemed quieter, its ticking subdued, as if it too was mourning what we'd lost. David and I moved around the house like ghosts sharing the same space but living in different worlds. Conversations were few, glances even fewer. The laughter that once filled these rooms had long fled, leaving only the faint echo of what used to be a family. One evening, as I stood by the window watching the sunset blur into orange and violet, David came up behind me. His reflection appeared beside mine in the glass, older, wearier, smaller than I remembered. "I've been trying to call him," he said softly. "He won't answer." "I know," I replied. "He's angry, David. He has every right to be." I was hoping. He hesitated. "Maybe if I explain what?" I turned to face him. "That you betrayed his mother? That you slept with the woman who'd one day fall in love with him? What explanation could make that right?" He looked down, shame clouding his eyes. "You're right. There's no excuse." Silence followed, heavy, almost sacred. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I'll move out for a while." I blinked. "What?" "I think it's best," he said quietly. "For both of us. Maybe for Matthew too. I don't want to make things worse." I wanted to protest, but the truth was I didn't have the strength. The damage had already been done. His presence felt like a constant reminder of everything that had fallen apart. So I nodded. "Maybe you're right." He packed that same night a small suitcase, nothing more. When he turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Regret that wasn't just about being caught, but about the life he'd fractured. When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the kind that hurt. It was the kind that let me breathe again. For the first time in weeks, I sat at the table alone and let the tears come freely. Not the quiet ones I'd been hiding, but the kind that came from deep inside, raw, unfiltered, human. It wasn't just grief for what he'd done. It was grief for everything that could never be repaired. A few days later, I found a letter on the porch. No name, just folded neatly inside an envelope that smelled faintly of lavender. Emily's scent. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Mrs. Green, I hope you can forgive me for leaving without saying goodbye. I didn't want to cause more pain. I still don't. I love Matthew with everything I have, but I can't stay in a place that reminds him of his father's betrayal. I know what it feels like to be lied to, and I can't stand being part of someone else's heartbreak. I'm sorry. For what happened, for what it cost, for the pain it brought you. Please tell Matthew that I never meant to hurt him. If I could go back and change everything, I would." Emily, by the time I finished reading, my tears had blurred the words. She was gone, and I couldn't even blame her for leaving. That night, I called Matthew. To my surprise, he picked up. His voice sounded rough, tired, the kind of tired that goes beyond sleepless nights. "Mom," he said quietly. "I got her letter too." I hesitated. "Are you okay?" He laughed bitterly. "No, but I'm trying." There was a long pause before he added, "You know what's crazy? I don't even hate her, or him. I thought I would, but I don't. I just feel empty. I wanted to tell him that emptiness doesn't last forever, that one day he'd fill it again with something softer, forgiveness maybe. But I couldn't bring myself to lie, not anymore. Instead, I said gently, "It'll take time." "Yeah," he whispered. "Maybe too much." When we hung up, I sat there in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at the two empty chairs across from me, one that used to belong to the man I married, and the other to the girl who'd unknowingly carried his past into my son's heart. Life has a cruel way of circling back on itself. What we bury never really stays buried. Over the next few months, David called a few times. I answered less and less, not out of anger, but because I needed distant space to rediscover who I was without him. I spent mornings walking by the lake, evenings tending to the garden, and in the quiet rhythm of those days, I found a strange kind of peace. It wasn't happiness, not yet. But it was a start. Then, one afternoon, as I trimmed the roses by the fence, Matthew appeared. He looked older somehow, not in age but in spirit. His eyes had lost that restless fire and gained something deeper. "Hey, Mom," he said softly. "Hi, sweetheart." I smiled, surprised. "I wasn't sure you'd come by," he shrugged. "I needed to see you." We sat on the porch, watching the sun sink low. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then, he said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot. About Dad, about Emily, about everything." I looked at him carefully. "And?" He took a deep breath. "I can't change what happened, but I can choose what comes next. I'm done being angry. It's exhausting." His words caught me off guard, not because they were unexpected, but because they carried a strength I hadn't seen in him before. "I think that's brave," I said softly. He nodded. "I still love her, Mom. Part of me probably always will. But maybe loving someone doesn't always mean keeping them. Maybe it just means letting go the right way." There was wisdom in his pain, the kind that only heartbreak can teach. As the sky deepened into dusk, I reached for his hand. "You've grown into a good man, Matthew. Better than either of us deserve," he smiled faintly. "You always say that." And in that quiet, something in me healed a little, not completely, but enough to breathe again. Autumn arrived quietly that year. The leaves began to fall in slow spirals, painting the streets in burnt oranges and deep reds. The air carried that familiar crispness, a sign that something was ending. Yet something else was waiting to begin. It had been nearly 4 months since David left. The house no longer felt like a battlefield, but it didn't feel like home either. It was more like a waiting room between what had been and what was yet to come. Matthew came by more often now, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit in silence with me. He didn't bring up Emily much, but I knew she lingered in his thoughts. You can't erase love that easily, not when it had once felt like the future. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, I found one of David's shirts tucked between the sheets. I stared at it for a long time. The faint scent of his cologne still clung to the fabric, mixed with something softer memory, maybe. I sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed the shirt to my face. I didn't cry. I'd already run out of tears weeks ago. Instead, I just whispered, "Why did you do it?" Even though I knew no answer would come. Forgiveness is strange. It doesn't arrive as a grand moment of peace. It creeps in slowly, like sunlight slipping through curtains after a long night. You resist it at first because it feels unfair, like letting someone off too easily. But eventually, you realize forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. That realization came to me one evening when I least expected it. I was at the grocery store picking up apples when I saw a familiar figure at the end of the aisle. David. He looked different, thinner, older. His once confident stride had softened into something uncertain. When he saw me, he froze, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to do. Then, slowly, he approached. "Ellen," he said softly, as if testing whether he still had the right to say my name. "David." My voice came out calm, steady. He gave a small nod, hands shoved into his coat pockets. "You look well." "I'm trying," I said simply. There was an awkward silence before he spoke again. "I've been going to therapy, trying to understand myself better, what I did, why I did it." I wanted to roll my eyes, to dismiss it as too little, too late, but there was sincerity in his tone, a quiet humility I hadn't heard before. He continued, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did to you, but for how long I let my pride stop me from saying it. For a moment, I saw not the man who betrayed me, but the one I'd once fallen in love with, flawed, human, broken in all the ways he tried to hide. I nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that. He swallowed hard. How's Matthew? He's healing, I replied. He's learning to forgive you too, in his own way. David's eyes softened with a kind of grief only a father can know. I miss him. I know. We stood there for a few seconds longer, two people bound by years of love, mistakes, and memories that refused to fade completely. Then I said quietly, "Take care of yourself, David." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "You too, Ellen." And just like that, he walked away, not out of my life, but out of the moment. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to call him back. When I got home that evening, I found Matthew sitting on the porch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I approached. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, sweetheart, guess who called me?" he said, setting the phone down. "Dad," I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Yeah, he didn't say much. Just wanted to check in." He paused, his eyes thoughtful. I didn't hang up this time. That small sentence carried more weight than he probably realized. "How did it feel?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "Weird, but not bad." I think I needed to hear his voice again, just to know I could without breaking apart. I smiled faintly. "That's growth, Matthew," he shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of holding on to anger." The way he said it made me proud. Anger can keep you warm, but it can also burn you alive if you hold it too long. As the evening faded into night, we sat together on the porch, the sound of crickets filling the silence. For once, it didn't feel empty. After a while, Matthew said quietly, "You know, I still think about her, Emily." "I know," I said softly. "She's doing okay. I saw a post online. She's in Seattle now working with a nonprofit. She looks happy." I looked at him gently. "Does it hurt?" He smiled sadly. "Less than it used to." "I guess that's something," I nodded. "That's healing," he glanced at me. "Do you ever think about Dad? Like, the good parts?" The question caught me off guard, but I didn't shy away from it. "Sometimes," I admitted, because those moments were real too. The mistakes don't erase them. They just change how we remember. He leaned back, watching the stars begin to emerge. "I think I get that now." We sat there until the night grew cold, wrapped in a quiet kind of understanding that didn't need words. Life doesn't give you neat endings. It gives you threads, some frayed, some strong, and it's up to you to weave them into something that still feels whole. And maybe, in our own broken way, we were learning how to do just that. Winter came early that year, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and lingered, whispering memories you thought you'd buried. Snow fell in soft waves outside my window, wrapping the world in silence. It had been almost a year since everything unraveled. The house had changed not just in the way it looked, but in the way it felt. I'd repainted the walls, moved the furniture, donated most of David's things. It wasn't an act of anger, but of reclaiming space. My space. Sometimes healing means rewriting the story of your surroundings until they finally reflect who you've become. Matthew was visiting more often, and this time, when he did, he brought something unexpected. Laughter. Real laughter, the kind that used to fill our house before the truth took it apart. He had a new light in his eyes. A quiet steadiness. And though Emily's name rarely crossed his lips, I could tell she still lingered somewhere in his heart, not as pain, but as a lesson. One Sunday morning, as we sat sipping coffee, he said something that stayed with me. "You know, Mom, I used to think love was supposed to be perfect, that if it hurt, it wasn't real. But maybe the truth is love always hurts a little. Because it makes you vulnerable. It exposes you." I smiled faintly. "You sound like your father used to in his better years." He chuckled softly. "Guess I got the best parts of both of you." I didn't tell him, but that simple sentence warmed something inside me that had been cold for too long. Later that afternoon, as he helped me shovel snow from the driveway, he suddenly said, "Dad's been calling more. We talk sometimes." I stopped, leaning on the shovel. "You do?" He nodded. "Yeah, just small things at first: work, weather, sports. But it's getting easier." I watched him quietly. "That's good, Matthew. I'm glad." He hesitated, then added, "He asked if he could come by for dinner sometime." The word dinner caught me off guard. That word, after everything that happened, carried a weight I hadn't expected. Matthew noticed my pause. "Only if you're comfortable with it," he said gently. I told him I'd ask you first. I thought about it for a moment. The idea of having David at that table again made my chest tighten, but another part of me, the part that had been quietly healing, whispered that maybe this was the next step. "All right," I said finally. "He can come." Matthew smiled faintly, as if relieved. That Friday I cooked like I used to. Nothing fancy, just roast chicken, garlic potatoes, and a salad. The smell of rosemary and butter filled the air, and for a brief moment it felt like old times. When the doorbell rang, my heart skipped. David stood there in a dark coat, holding a small bouquet of tulips. His hair had more gray than I remembered, and his eyes looked softer, tired, but kind. "Hi, Ellen," he said quietly. "Hi, David." He handed me the flowers. "For you. I know you always like tulips." I took them gently. "Thank you." The evening began cautiously. The three of us sat around the table, the same one that had witnessed so much love, laughter, and betrayal alike. For a while it felt awkward, like we were trying to remember how to be a family. But slowly conversation found its rhythm. Matthew asked about work. I asked about the apartment he was living in. We talked about the holidays, about small things that didn't matter but somehow did. And as I watched them, father and son, sitting across from each other, I realized something. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from grand apologies or sweeping gestures. It comes from moments like this, simple, quiet, human. After dinner, Matthew excused himself to take a call, leaving the two of us alone. David cleared his throat. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to this," he said. "Neither was I admitted. He gave a small, sad smile. "I don't deserve your kindness." "It's not about deserving," I said softly. "It's about peace." He nodded, his gaze falling to the table. "I still think about that night, you know, when everything came out. I replay it in my head, wondering if there's anything I could have said to make it hurt less." "There wasn't," I said honestly. "Some pain just has to exist." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't expect things to ever go back to what they were. But I do hope one day when you think of me, it's not with hate." I met his eyes. "I stopped hating you a long time ago, David. Hate is heavy. I was tired of carrying it." He looked stunned for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you. That means more than you know." We sat there for a while in comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have said everything there is to say. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "You look peaceful, Ellen," he said softly. "I'm glad." As the door closed behind him, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure, because life doesn't give you that so easily, but something gentler. Acceptance, maybe. The next morning, I found a note on the counter. It was from Matthew. "Mom, last night was the first time in a long time that dinner felt normal. Thank you for making that happen. You've always held this family together even when it was falling apart. I love you, M." Tears filled my eyes as I folded the note. The same table that once carried the weight of betrayal now held something lighter, reconciliation, forgiveness, the fragile beginnings of hope. And as the morning sun spilled into the kitchen, I realized something profound. Sometimes, what breaks us doesn't end us. It transforms us. The following weeks passed quietly, marked by small moments of grace I didn't expect. David began calling occasionally, not to rekindle anything, but to check in. To ask if Matthew was doing well. To ask if I was all right. There was no hidden agenda in his voice anymore, just sincerity. It surprised me, how easily peace began to weave itself into places that once felt scorched. One afternoon, I found myself sitting by the kitchen window, the same one where I'd once stared into the darkness, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Now sunlight poured through it, warm and forgiving. I brewed a cup of tea and realized how long it had been since I'd felt genuinely still. Matthew stopped by that evening, carrying a grocery bag. "I brought you something," he said with a small grin. Inside were my favorite things: fresh bread from the bakery downtown, a jar of honey, and a small photo frame. When I looked closer, I realized it was a picture from years ago, the three of us at the beach, arms around each other, smiling at nothing in particular. I found it while cleaning up Dad's old stuff. Matthew said softly. I thought maybe you'd want it. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The photo felt like a memory suspended in amber, a moment untouched by the chaos that came after. Thank you, I whispered, brushing my thumb over the frame. He smiled faintly. You know, I used to hate that picture. I thought my hair looked weird. I laughed, really laughed, and the sound felt strange, unfamiliar, like rediscovering a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. He joined me at the table, his tone turning thoughtful. Do you ever wish you could go back? Before everything happened? I thought about that for a long time. The question held more weight than he probably intended. Sometimes, I admitted, but not to erase what happened. Just to hold on to who we were for a little longer, before we learned how fragile everything really is. He nodded slowly, his eyes softening. Yeah, me too. The conversation drifted to lighter things after that: work, neighbors, his plans to start traveling more. But even as we talked, I felt an undercurrent of something deeper between us, a quiet understanding that we'd both changed, grown, and survived something that could have broken us completely. After he left that night, I placed the photo on the mantel. It didn't hurt to look at anymore. It reminded me that love, even when flawed, still existed once. And that mattered. A few days later, I received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "From Emily." For a moment, I just stared at it, my hands hovering above the keyboard. My first instinct was hesitation. Would opening it reopen wounds I'd only just managed to close? But curiosity and maybe compassion won out. The message was short, but heartfelt. Mrs. Green, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I wanted to thank you not just for your kindness, but for your grace. You could have hated me, and no one would have blamed you. But instead you listened. You let me speak. That changed more than you know. I've started over in Seattle. I'm working at a youth shelter now. Every day I meet girls who remind me of who I used to be: scared, uncertain, searching for belonging. I try to help them find their way, the way you helped me find mine. I hope you and Matthew are well. Emily. I reread it twice, my heart swelling with something between sadness and pride. She had taken her pain and turned it into something good, something healing. That night, I showed Matthew the message. He read it silently, then looked up with misty eyes. She's helping people. That's amazing, I nodded. Yes, it is. He smiled faintly, then whispered, I'm happy for her, really. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a quiet acceptance. The kind that comes when you finally release someone without resentment. Maybe that's what love is, I said softly. Not holding on, but wishing someone well, even from a distance. Matthew leaned back, his gaze distant but peaceful. You're right, Mom. It's funny, I thought losing her would break me. But I think it made me stronger instead. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. That's how life works. It tests you until you learn the strength you never knew you had. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, gentle, almost hesitant. The world looked softer beneath it, like it was forgiving itself for everything harsh that had come before. Later that night, as I sat in bed reading, I thought about all the ways love can exist between partners, between parents and children, even between strangers who share nothing but pain and empathy. We often think love is about holding on, but sometimes it's about knowing when to let go and doing it with grace. The next morning, I took that photo of us from the mantel and placed it beside my bed. It didn't make me ache anymore. It made me grateful for the years we had, for the lessons I learned, and even for the heartbreak that reshaped me into someone stronger, softer, wiser, because the truth is, life doesn't give you perfect stories. It gives you imperfect ones that teach you what love, forgiveness, and resilience really mean, and maybe that's the most honest kind of ending there is. Spring came quietly, as if the earth itself was holding its breath before exhaling warmth again. The snow melted into rivers that whispered through the streets, and the air smelled faintly of new beginnings, damp soil, blooming lilacs, and hope. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the color green until that season. Everything that had felt gray and muted for months suddenly came back to life, just like the pieces of me that had been slowly waking up inside. Matthew started spending his weekends volunteering at a youth shelter in the city, the same one Emily worked at. I didn't ask if they'd spoken. I didn't have to. I could see it in his eyes when he talked about the work, the light there, the compassion. One evening, as he helped me prepare dinner, he said quietly, "Mom, I think I'm going to move to Seattle for a while." I paused, setting down the knife. "Seattle?" He nodded. "Yeah, they offered me a position at the shelter. It feels right, you know. I want to do something that matters." There was no bitterness in his voice, no hidden ache, just purpose. I smiled, though my heart pinched softly. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." "I'm proud of you." He looked at me, his expression tender. "You're not upset?" "Upset?" I shook my head. "No. You've spent your whole life trying to fix what others broke. Now you get to build something of your own." His eyes glistened slightly. "You always know what to say." I laughed gently. "That's because I've lived enough life to know when to stop holding people back." That night, after he left, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the moon rise above the trees. It struck me how much had changed not just around me, but within me. Once I would have been afraid of being alone. But now solitude didn't scare me. It felt peaceful, like a quiet friend who didn't demand explanations. The next morning, I got a text from David. I heard Matthew's moving. "I'm proud of him. You too, Ellen. You did what I couldn't, you kept us together." For the first time, his words didn't make me ache. They made me smile. A week later, Matthew came by to pack up some things before his move. I helped him fold clothes, box up books, and label the kitchenware he'd borrowed permanently. The air was light, playful, filled with small jokes that made the goodbye a little softer. When everything was packed, we sat in the living room surrounded by cardboard boxes, a strange, nostalgic mirror of the day he left for college years ago. "Do you think Dad will ever forgive himself?" he asked suddenly. I looked at him carefully. "Maybe, but forgiveness isn't something you earn, Matthew. It's something you grow into. Just like peace." He nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "You sound like a therapist," I grinned. "No, just a woman who's learned the hard way." Before he left, he hugged me longer than usual. The kind of hug that says thank you and I'll miss you without needing words. When his car disappeared down the street, the silence that followed was both heavy and light at the same time. I stood there for a while, the wind brushing against my face, carrying the faint scent of the tulips David had planted years ago. And for a moment, I didn't feel broken. I just felt alive. A few weeks later, I received a postcard from Seattle. "Mom, it rains here almost every day, but I don't mind. I see Emily sometimes not in the way we used to, but in passing. We talk, it's good. She seems happy. I think I finally understand what you meant about love being about peace, not possession. I miss you, but I'm okay, really. Love, M." I smiled as I read it. It was short, simple, but it said everything that needed to be said. That night, I placed the postcard beside the framed photo on the mantel, my two reminders of how far we'd come. Sometimes, healing isn't about returning to who you were before. It's about becoming someone new, someone who can look back without flinching. Months passed like pages turning gently. David called once in a while. We'd chat about small things, weather, books, news. There was no tension, no resentment. Just two people who had finally made peace with the ruins of what used to be love. One day, I found an old recipe book tucked behind the pantry shelf, my mother's handwriting on the cover, faded but familiar. I opened it and found a note pressed between the pages, written years ago in my own hand. "Don't forget who you are when the noise gets loud." I smiled softly. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten. But life has a funny way of bringing you back to yourself, doesn't it? That evening, I made one of my mother's old recipes, lemon chicken, with herbs, the same dish I'd cooked the first time Emily came to dinner and couldn't bring herself to eat. I set the table for one. Not because I was lonely, but because I wanted to honor how far that table had come from a place of secrets to a place of peace. As I ate, I whispered softly, to no one and everyone, "We're okay now," and I meant it. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain. The world had turned again, and this time, I was ready to turn with it. Summer arrived in gentle waves, warm mornings that smelled of jasmine and honey, and nights that hummed with crickets and the sound of wind brushing through open windows. It was the kind of summer that didn't demand anything from you, just offered quiet companionship. I'd started tending the garden again. The soil, once neglected, had begun to bloom under my hands. There was something deeply healing about watching new life push through the earth, fragile yet determined. Just like me. Every morning, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunlight stretch across the grass. The world had stopped feeling like something to survive and started feeling like something to savor. One morning, as I trimmed the rose bushes, I noticed a familiar car pull into the driveway. David. He stepped out slowly, wearing a soft blue shirt I didn't recognize and carrying an envelope. I wasn't startled, more curious than anything. We hadn't seen each other in months, though we'd spoken a few times by phone. "Morning," he said, offering a gentle smile. "Morning," I replied. "You look well. So do you." He glanced around the yard. "You've brought it back to life," I smiled faintly. "I guess I finally learned how to grow again." He nodded, the weight of those words settling between us. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said softly. "I just wanted to drop this off." He handed me the envelope. "What is it?" "Something I've been meaning to give you for a while." I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, handwritten, neat, thoughtful. "Ellen, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the kind of man I was, and the kind of man I want to be. I won't ask for forgiveness again, you've already given me more than I deserve. But I wanted to tell you that leaving wasn't about running away. It was about stepping back so I could face the truth without dragging you through it again. I've made peace with what happened. I hope you have too. You once told me that love isn't something that ends, it just changes shape. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Whatever we were, Ellen, thank you for letting it matter. David." I read it twice, my heart steady, not racing like it once would have. There were no tears this time, just a deep, quiet gratitude for closure that had taken its time arriving. When I looked up, David was watching me carefully. "I hope it doesn't reopen anything," he said softly. "It doesn't," I assured him. "If anything, it closes the door gently," he smiled, relief flickering across his face. "I'm glad." We stood there for a few more moments, just two people who had finally laid down the weight of the past. Then as he turned to leave, he paused. "Ellen?" "Yes? Thank you. For not hating me. For helping Matthew forgive me. For everything." I met his eyes and said quietly, "You made mistakes, David. But we all do. What matters is who we become afterward." He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in something between sadness and peace. Then he got into his car and drove away. When the sound of the engine faded, I stood for a moment, letting the stillness settle over me. It wasn't the end of something anymore. It was just life, moving on. Later that afternoon, Matthew called. "Hey, Mom, guess what?" "What?" "I got promoted at the shelter. Program coordinator," I grinned. "That's wonderful, Matthew. Thanks. It's been busy, but good busy, you know? Oh, and you'll never believe this. Emily's engaged." I froze for a second, then smiled softly. "Is she?" "Yeah," he said, his tone light. "To one of the other coordinators. She sent me an invitation. I think she wanted to make sure I heard it from her. How do you feel about that?" I asked gently. He paused. "Surprisingly, you're happy. I mean, it's weird, sure, but I'm genuinely happy for her. She deserves peace." I could hear the smile in his voice, and it filled my chest with something warm. "So do you," I said. "Yeah," he laughed softly. "I think I finally found it." When the call ended, I sat quietly for a while, thinking about everything that had brought us to this moment. The pain, the confusion, the years of silence that had finally turned into understanding. That night, I found myself back at the dining table. The same one where it had all begun, where secrets had been revealed. Tears had fallen, and truths had found their voices. But now, it felt different, lighter. The ghosts that once lingered there had finally moved on. I set a single candle in the center of the table and lit it. The flame flickered softly, its glow dancing across the wood. It wasn't for mourning anymore. It was for gratitude for everything that had happened, and for everything that still could. Because the truth is, life doesn't wait for you to be ready to start over. It begins again the moment you decide to let the light in. Outside, the evening breeze carried the faint scent of tulips. I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time in a long time, my heart felt quiet, not empty. not broken, just still, and in that stillness, I realized something simple and profound. Some stories don't end in reunion or revenge. They end in peace, and that's enough. The weeks after David's visit were gentle ones. The world felt slower, kinder, like it had finally stopped testing me. Every morning began with sunlight spilling across my kitchen counter, and every evening ended with the soft hum of crickets outside my window. I had grown fond of these quiet days, of the way the kettle whistled just before the tea boiled, of the pages of my book turning in rhythm with the wind. There was something profoundly peaceful about a life that no longer demanded constant survival. Sometimes I'd catch myself remembering the past, not the pain of it, but the life within it. A laugh here, a memory there. Even the things that once hurt had softened around the edges. Time had done what time always does. It didn't erase, but it dulled the ache until it became bearable. One afternoon, while sorting through an old box of photos, I found one that made me pause. It was of me, David, and Matthew standing in front of the old house before the renovations, years ago. My hair was shorter then, my smile wider, my eyes full of the kind of certainty only youth and love can give. I traced the edges of the photo, and for a moment, I didn't see the mistakes or the heartbreak. I just saw a woman who loved deeply, and a family that, despite its flaws, had once been whole. Later that evening, I received a call from Matthew. "Mom, I've been thinking," he began, his tone warm but hesitant. "I want to fly you out here to visit. Seattle's beautiful this time of year." I laughed softly. "You just want me to cook for you, don't you?" He chuckled. "Maybe a little. But mostly I just miss you. I think you'd love it here, the ocean, the quiet, the people." "All right," I said. "I'll come." It was the first trip I'd taken alone in years. On the plane, I stared out at the clouds, thinking about how much had changed, how much I had changed. Once I used to dread the unknown. Now I saw it as a blank page. When I arrived, Matthew was waiting at the gate, smiling. His arms wrapped around me in that warm, familiar way that only a son's embrace can. "You look happy," he said. "I am," I replied. "And so do you," he grinned. "Come on, there's someone I want you to meet." He drove me through the city, tall glass buildings mixed with cozy cafes, flowers blooming along every corner, the sky painted in soft blues and golds. Seattle had a quiet rhythm that felt like forgiveness made tangible. When we arrived at the shelter, I met a dozen faces, kind, bright, full of purpose. The air buzzed with laughter, the kind that only comes from people doing work that matters. And then I saw her, Emily. She was standing near the garden, talking to a young girl, her expression gentle and attentive. Her hair was shorter now, her posture more confident, her spirit lighter. For a moment, she didn't notice me. When she finally did, her eyes widened not with fear, but with surprise and warmth. "Mrs. Green," she said softly. "Approaching. Emily," I greeted, my smile genuine. There was a quiet pause between us, the kind that carries more meaning than words ever could. Then she said, "You look wonderful." "So do you," I replied. And I meant it. We stood there for a while, just looking at each other, two women who had been bound by pain, now meeting again through healing. "I'm glad you came," she said finally. "Matthew's been amazing here." "The kids love him," I laughed softly. "He's always had a good heart." "He gets that from you," she said, her voice tender. Her words struck something deep inside me, not guilt, not regret, but gratitude. For the way life, in its strange, imperfect beauty, finds a way to make things whole again. We spent the afternoon together, the three of us talking, sharing stories, and even laughing. Not the forced laughter of pretending, but the kind that grows from acceptance. When the day ended, the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the world in gold. As I watched them, Matthew and Emily standing side by side, I realized that the lines between past and present had finally blurred. There was no before or after anymore. Just this, the moment. That evening, as we sat by the water, Matthew turned to me and said, "Mom, do you ever think we were meant to go through all of it? I mean, not the pain, exactly. But the lessons?" I thought for a moment, the sound of waves soft against the pier. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe some things don't happen to us but for us. To teach us who we're meant to become." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the sunset. "Then I think I'm finally becoming who I'm meant to be," I smiled, my heart swelling with quiet pride. You are, sweetheart. As the sky deepened into twilight, I felt a peace settle over me, not fleeting, not fragile, but deep and steady. The kind of peace that comes when you stop wishing for what could have been and start embracing what is. Because life doesn't always give you perfect endings. Sometimes it gives you something better: understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet joy of moving forward. And as the stars began to appear, one by one, I whispered softly to myself, "We made it." The following days in Seattle passed like pages from a peaceful book. The city seemed alive yet calm, with its quiet streets, soft drizzle, and the gentle hum of life that felt perfectly in rhythm with where I was in my journey. Matthew showed me around Pike Place Market, the waterfront, the parks dotted with laughter and music. We stopped by little cafes where the smell of fresh coffee wrapped around you like an embrace. For the first time in years, I felt light, not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. One morning, I woke before sunrise and found myself standing by Matthew's apartment window, looking out at the world still half asleep. The sky was painted in shades of lavender and gray, and I could hear the faint sound of gulls calling from the harbor. It struck me then, how far we'd come, how far I'd come. There was a time when the weight of betrayal felt like it would never lift, when every breath hurt and every tomorrow felt uncertain. But here I was, still standing, still breathing, still finding beauty in a quiet dawn. When Matthew woke up, we decided to visit the youth shelter again. It wasn't about checking in on anyone this time, it was just about being there. The children greeted me like I'd always been part of their world. One of the girls, no older than 12, handed me a drawing she'd made, 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "That's you, Matthew and Emily," she said proudly. "You're all happy." I smiled and thanked her, but inside I felt something deeper. Children see life in its simplest truth, not through the lens of the past, but through the hope of what's possible. Later that afternoon, while helping serve lunch, Emily sat beside me at one of the tables. The kids were laughing nearby, their voices echoing like music through the hall. "You know," she said, her tone thoughtful, "I used to think pain ruined people. That once you'd been through something awful, you'd never be the same." I looked at her, curious. "And now?" She smiled faintly. "Now I think pain just strips away everything that's false. It leaves you raw, but it also leaves you real." I nodded. "That's wisdom earned the hard way." She laughed softly. "The only kind worth having." For a while, we sat in silence, watching the children play. Then, almost hesitantly, she said, "I want to thank you again, not just for how you handled things, but for showing me what grace looks like. I don't think I could have healed if you'd hated me." Her words caught me off guard. I reached out, gently placing my hand over hers. "You didn't deserve hate, Emily. You were caught in something you never asked for. And you faced it with honesty that matters." She blinked back tears. "You're a good woman, Mrs. Green," I smiled softly. "Just a woman who's made her share of mistakes." We both laughed quietly, and in that laughter, the last remnants of old pain seemed to dissolve. That evening, Matthew took me to the waterfront again. The sun dipped low, the sky alive with orange fire and soft pink edges. Couples walked by hand in hand, families shared laughter, and somewhere in the distance, a musician played a slow tune on his guitar. "Beautiful, isn't it?" He said. "It is," I replied. "The kind of beauty that doesn't ask to be noticed, it just exists." He looked at me, a gentle smile on his face. "You know, Mom, I think we're all finally okay." "I think so too." He nodded, staring out at the water. "I used to wish things had happened differently, but now I don't think I'd change anything. We wouldn't be who we are without it." His words lingered in the air, soft, true, and filled with quiet strength. I reached for his hand, and for a long while, we just sat there in silence. The world around us moved, waves lapped, lights flickered on. Laughter carried through the breeze, but we stayed still, content in the simplicity of the moment. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything we'd lost and everything we'd found in its place. The love, the pain, the mistakes, they were all threads in the same tapestry. Imperfect, yes, but still beautiful when you stepped back far enough to see the whole picture. I realized then that healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in small doses, in forgiveness, in laughter, in the courage to start again even when your heart still trembles. And sometimes, it comes in the form of a quiet morning, a warm cup of tea, and the sound of your son's voice reminding you that you're not alone. Before I drifted to sleep, I whispered a small prayer not of asking, but of thanks, for endurance, for second chances, for the kind of love that survives even when everything else falls away. Because the truth is, life never promises fairness. But it does offer redemption if we're brave enough to reach for it. And I was. Finally, I was. The morning I was supposed to fly back home, Seattle greeted me with soft rain, the kind that doesn't fall, but floats, like mist that kisses the skin instead of soaking it. The world outside the window was gray and silver, yet somehow alive, glowing with a quiet tenderness. Matthew insisted on driving me to the airport. "You sure you don't want to stay a few more days?" he asked as we loaded my suitcase into the car. I smiled. "If I stay longer, I'll never leave." "And you need to get back to work, Mr. Coordinator." He laughed, that easy, gentle laugh that had been missing from his voice for so long. All right. But you have to promise to come back soon." "I promise," I said. The drive was peaceful. We didn't talk much, we didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, like music that no longer needed words. At the airport, when he hugged me goodbye, he whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom, for holding us together." Even when we didn't deserve it, I smiled through tears. That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We hold the world until it learns how to stand again. When I boarded the plane and looked out the window, the rain had stopped. The clouds broke apart just enough for a soft ray of sunlight to spill through. I took it as a sign not of endings, but of continuations. The flight home felt shorter than I expected. Maybe because the distance between who I was and who I'd become didn't feel so wide anymore. When I walked into my house, it smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish, the scent of a home that's been loved, even in its quietness. I set my suitcase down and stood in the middle of the living room, just breathing. The photo of our family still sat on the mantel. The postcard from Matthew was beside it. Everything looked the same, yet everything wasn't. I made myself tea, sat by the window, and let the memories flow not as pain, but as gratitude for Emily, who had unknowingly revealed the truth that changed everything. For David, who had fallen, learned, and finally faced his own reflection. For Matthew, who had carried love and heartbreak and somehow managed to grow softer instead of bitter. And for myself, the woman who had survived it all and learned that forgiveness wasn't a weakness, but the deepest form of strength. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold, I wrote in my journal something I hadn't done in years. There was a time I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was losing trust. But now I see it wasn't losing trust that broke me. It was losing faith in my own ability to heal. And once I found that again, I found everything else too. The next few months unfolded quietly. I started painting again, landscapes mostly. Gentle skies, soft light, the kind of scenes that felt like breathing. One of my paintings even ended up hanging at the local cafe. The owner said customers lingered longer by that wall, as if something in the brushstrokes made them feel safe. That made me smile. Maybe healing had a color after all. One morning, as I watered the tulips by the fence, I noticed something new, a single, pale yellow bloom pushing through the soil where nothing had grown for years. I crouched beside it, brushing the petals gently. It felt symbolic, a quiet promise from the universe that even after everything, life finds a way to return. That evening, as twilight spread across the sky, I made dinner just for one. But it didn't feel lonely anymore. I poured a glass of wine, set a single candle in the center of the table, and said softly to the empty chair across from me, "We made it through." I thought of all the dinners before, the laughter, the arguments, the silence, the tears. And now, sitting here, I realized the table had seen it all. The beginning, the breaking, and the becoming. When the phone rang, I smiled even before answering. "Matthew?" I said warmly. "Hi, Mom." His voice came through, filled with that familiar joy. "I just wanted to hear your voice." "I'm here," I said softly. "Always." We talked about his work, the new program he was starting, how Emily and her fiancé were helping expand the shelter. Every word felt like sunlight. Before hanging up, he said. You know, I think about Dad sometimes. I think he's trying, slowly. I know, I replied. Some people take longer to find their peace. Yeah, he said, then paused. I think we all did. After we said goodbye, I sat there for a while, staring at the candle flickering gently. Its flame danced like a heartbeat, steady, quiet, alive. And I thought about how strange and beautiful it was that the story which began with secrets and silence had somehow ended in light. Not a perfect light, not blinding or dramatic, but the kind that hums softly, the kind you learn to trust again after the darkness. Because that's what life really is, isn't it? A series of shadows and dawns, of heartbreaks and healings, of endings that quietly turn into beginnings. And if you're patient enough, if you listen closely enough, you'll find that even in the quietest moments, love never really leaves. It just changes shape softer, wiser, truer. That night, I closed my journal, blew out the candle, and whispered into the still air, "Thank you. For all of it." And for the first time in a long time, I meant every word. The seasons continued to turn, each one gentler than the last. Time didn't erase the past, but it softened it like waves smoothing the edges of sharp stones. Every sunrise seemed to whisper the same quiet message. You made it through. I found myself noticing beauty in small things again. The sound of birds at dawn, the feel of warm bread between my hands, the laughter of children playing down the street. It wasn't that my life was suddenly full of grand moments, it was full of simple ones, the kind I had learned to treasure most. Sometimes I'd walk through the neighborhood and see couples holding hands, and instead of feeling bitterness, I'd smile. Love still existed in them, in Matthew, in Emily, even in the memory of David. It had taken different forms, changed shapes, but it was still there. It always had been. One Sunday, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the mail arrived. Among the bills and flyers was a small envelope with handwriting I recognized immediately David's. Inside was a single card. No long explanations, no apologies. Just a photograph. It was of him standing beside a restored garden, his new home perhaps. The caption on the back read, "For years I didn't know how to nurture anything real. Now I do. Thank you for teaching me, even when I didn't deserve it." I smiled through tears. It wasn't sorrow anymore, it was release. We had both found our way, separately, but in peace. That evening, I took out my journal one last time and wrote, "Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without pain. It's about looking at what once broke you and realizing it no longer owns you. And when that happens, you begin to live again not as who you were, but as who you've become." The candle beside me burned low, its flame flickering softly, almost like it was listening. Before closing the journal, I added one final line. I used to think our story ended in betrayal, but now I see it ended in becoming. Outside, the night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. The moon hung low, its light spilling gently across the garden. The tulips, once fragile, now strong, swayed with the breeze, and as I watched them, I felt the same gentle truth bloom inside me. Some endings aren't endings at all. They're just the beginning of peace. I leaned back in my chair, wrapped in the comfort of my own stillness. The house that once echoed with the pain of secrets now hummed softly with peace. And when I finally closed my eyes, I didn't see the past anymore. I saw everything that had grown from it: love, forgiveness, and a life finally, beautifully, whole.